There are people with a perfect immune system, and yet their body destroys itself from the inside. And it's not due to a lack of defenses, it's not because of viruses, and it's not because of genetics either. It's because no one taught them how to protect themselves from themselves. In 1983, doctors discovered something disturbing. Children were born with a brilliant immune system, but without that ability to protect themselves, they ended up finding that their bodies attacked all their organs at once. They died quickly and not from weakness. They died from an excess of strength. Currently, that same mistake is made by millions of adults, and no one, or very few probably, have received an explanation as to why. Today we are going to talk about the great forgotten element of biology, the system that decides when it is going to stop. We are going to talk about the big mistake we made in understanding the immune system, because we believed that the problem was that we had an out-of-control army, and it turns out that what we needed to identify was the sheriff. And when there is no sheriff, even energy becomes dangerous. Well then, we are also going to wake up the sheriff. In the previous video, we shed some light on our cathedral. I explained to you how, without voltage, without those vital, life-giving millivolts of health, nothing in your body works properly. But now, consider for a moment that it is possible your cathedral, meaning your own body, is fully illuminated, shining with energy. Yet inside there is an army of brave, determined soldiers, all of them armed to the teeth, and then, quite suddenly, they all go completely crazy. And it can still be worse. Think that those soldiers have the mission to protect you from the dragons, the viruses, and from the invaders, the bacteria. But suddenly, you imagine that they start shooting at the walls of your own cathedral. They start destroying the furniture, burning the curtains, and attacking everyone they find inside. Well, this is actually what science sometimes refers to as autoimmunity. It's friendly fire, meaning your body, which is wise, for some reason forgets who the enemy is. And for years, medicine called this a system error. And today, however, we know that it is not an error at all. It is an absence of command when it occurs. Well, today I'm going to try to carefully explain to you why this particular chaos occurs. And above all, I'm going to introduce you so you can really get to know him, to the most important character in your entire defense system, the immune sheriff. If you have hypothyroidism, if your joints ache for no clear reason, if your skin gets inflamed, or if you simply feel that your body is at war with itself, stick around. Because today, we are going to learn how to activate what is the absolute master break of your biology. To understand the sheriff, first we must get to know the soldiers. And in your blood, there live some important warriors known as T-lymphocytes, which are called T because they are trained in a special organ that is located right here, just behind the sternum bone. This organ is called the thymus. The thymus was for many decades an ignored organ. And until the 1960s, many doctors thought that it was useless. Well, today, however, we know that without it, there is no biological identity. Just see how important it is. Well, these are the two types of soldiers I was telling you about. The CD4 T lymphocytes, which are the generals, that is, they are the ones who give the orders, detect the enemy and shout, attack. And then there are the CD8 T lymphocytes, which are the warriors. And these are the ones that execute, the ones that have the chemical weapons to destroy infected or cancerous cells. And these soldiers have on their surface some sensors called T-cell receptors, or TCR for short, and their job is to go through the body and recognize protein fragments. If the fragment is from a virus, it fires. And if the fragment is from your own body, they should ignore it. And now you'll ask me, how do they know if it's mine or if it's foreign? Well, this is thanks to a process called thymic selection. In the thymus, the soldiers are presented with a real photo album of all the proteins in your body. And if a soldier tries to attack one of those photos, what the body does is eliminate it before it gets into the blood. It's an absolutely brutal quality control. And now pay attention, because 95% of the soldiers, 95%, die in training because they are too aggressive. And then something else happens. Sometimes some defective soldiers escape, they go out on patrol, and suddenly they mistake a protein from your thyroid or your collagen for an enemy. And there, my friend, the disaster begins. This process is so brutal that when it was discovered, many scientists simply didn't believe it. A system that eliminates 95% of its own cells just to avoid chaos. You see, a young Australian immunologist, Jacques Miller, in 1961, and while working in London, was the first to demonstrate that the thymus was not a useless organ, but a truly ruthless military academy. What did he do? He removed the thymus from newborn mice, and the result was brutal. The mice couldn't defend themselves, but more importantly, he discovered something even more disturbing. They didn't know how to distinguish between self and non-self. And what was the conclusion? The thymus was not a useless organ, quite the opposite. The thymus is the place in the body where the immunological identity of your body is educated, and this broke a centuries-old dogma. From then on, several groups, especially at the American NIH, at the Pasteur Institute in France, and also in some laboratories in Germany, began to study what was happening inside the thymus. And what they discovered was difficult to accept. When T lymphocytes are trained, I've already told you that more than 90 or even 95% die, and they don't die because they are sick or because they fail, they die because they are too dangerous. And this process was called negative selection or clonal deletion. Well, let's think for a moment and go back to the scientists, to the time of the scientists in the 1970s. They had the deeply rooted idea that biology is wise, efficient, and economical, that it seeks to optimize resources and does not waste energy. And yet, here they had before them a system that does, or did, or continues to do, just the opposite. It deliberately eliminates the vast majority of its own cells. And it was real. In fact, not only was it real, it is still real. Well, in the 1980s, Philippa Marak and John Kapler confirmed something even more disturbing. The body deliberately eliminates the vast majority of its own soldiers. It was confirmed. There were doubts for a long time. They didn't want to accept it. They demonstrated that, without a doubt, the lymphocytes that recognize their own proteins are actively eliminated from the thymus. And it is not an accident, as I was saying, nor is it a secondary consequence, and much less an error. It is a decision of the system. The body prefers to destroy 95% of its army rather than risk facing an internal civil war. In other words, it does it to protect itself. Biology always understood something that we often forget. It is better to lose strength than to lose control. But don't be surprised, because we don't live in a body that sometimes fails. We live in a human body that has developed extremely complex systems to avoid chaos. And when that chaos does appear, it is not because of weakness, it is because the brakes have failed, not the soldiers. At this point, I'm going to take a short break. I have presented you with many concepts that may be new to you. Thymus, CD4 and CD8 lymphocytes, cell receptors. The truth is, it is not necessary for you to remember them, and much less to memorize them. There is only one thing here that is necessary, that you understand that this entire system exists with a single objective, so that your body does not mistake its enemy. And this is where, right now, our protagonist suddenly appears. In the midst of this entire aggressive army, there is a special peace brigade, the regulatory T cells, or simply the Tregs. Tregs were not discovered yesterday. In fact, they were intuited in the 70s, but nobody paid any attention to them. And you might ask, why? Well, it's very simple, because they didn't attack. And for decades, science only studied what destroys. In the 70s, several immunologists began to observe something strange, and in experiments with mice, they saw that even when the immune system was perfectly trained in the thymus, something else had to be acting in the periphery. Why? Well, because some animals did not develop autoimmunity, even though in theory they had potentially dangerous lymphocytes circulating. In other words, the thymus made a harsh and unforgiving selection in this process, but it was not the only filter. And it was then that an idea appeared that was almost heretical for the time. Someone said there must be some type of cell whose function is not to attack, but to stop. And in a very vague way, they called it a suppressor cell or suppressor cells, and that's where the problem began. These scientists were ignored. At that time, as I was saying, immunology was obsessed with killing bacteria, destroying viruses, understanding cancer and studying inflammation. And the logic they had was absolutely military. The immune system is like an army, and in an army the heroes are the ones who shoot, not the ones who say halt. And what happened? Well, it was more than evident that these supposed suppressor cells did not kill, did not cause inflammation, and did not produce antibodies. In fact, they were even boring from an experimental point of view. And what's more, to make matters even worse, the results were inconsistent. I mean, there were no clear markers. It wasn't known how to distinguish them well. And more than anything else, what they seemed to be was experimental noise, one of those things that happens around, but that doesn't give you confidence that they are interesting. And for almost 20 years, the concept was put away in a drawer. Meanwhile, what was happening in the thymus was becoming better understood, and it was already known that the thymus massively eliminates dangerous cells, but it was also recognized and sensed that it cannot be perfect, because life inevitably changes. New proteins appear, the tissues age, and the cells mutate. So, what came from all of that was that the question changed again. If the thymus trains soldiers, who watches the soldiers once they are out? And there, at last, the forgotten piece fell into place. In the 1990s, the Japanese immunologist Shimon Sakaguchi did something brilliant and simple, so simple that it was impossible to ignore. He took healthy mice and removed a small subgroup of T lymphocytes, but he did not remove the aggressive ones, not the ones that attack infections, but that silent group that no one yet fully understood. And the result was absolutely devastating. The mice began to develop massive autoimmune diseases, diabetes, intestinal inflammation, organ destruction, terrifying. And there were no viruses, there were no bacteria. In other words, the immune system was essentially mounting an attack against itself, turning its powerful defenses inward. When Sakaguchi, seeing this, returned those cells to the animal, the chaos stopped. And there, science had to accept something fundamental. Immunological tolerance is not passive. It is not a matter of doing nothing. No, it is an active process that requires specialized cells to put the brakes on situations. You might ask, put the brakes on what exactly? Well, stopping the attack when there is no enemy, stopping the inflammation before it becomes chronic, stopping the soldiers who have survived the thymus but are pointing in the wrong direction, stopping friendly fire, in short. Well, those cells finally received what is their current name today. Regulatory T cells, Tregs, which do not replace the thymus. What they do is complete it. The thymus trains the army, and what Tregs do is prevent civil war. If the other soldiers are children fighting in a playground, the Treg is the wise teacher, the one who does not use force, who carries no weapons. The Treg approaches the soldier who is shooting, puts a hand on his shoulder and says, "My friend, take it easy. This is not an enemy. We are in our own home. Put down the weapon, please." And a short time later, other researchers like Barry Brankow and Fred Ramsdell discovered something even more remarkable. All of those cells depended on a single master switch, a gene without which the brakes simply cannot exist. And that switch gene is called FOXP3. When FOXP3 fails, the immune system doesn't become weak, it becomes uncontrollable. And we will talk about it in a few minutes. Now, the most powerful thing of all was that this didn't just remain an academic hypothesis. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the year 2025 was awarded to Shimon Sakaguchi, Mary Branko, and Fred Ramsdell for their discoveries on how immune tolerance is maintained outside of the thymus. In other words, how the immune system regulates itself so it doesn't attack us. Sakaguchi identified the regulatory cells, the Tregs, that stop the attack, and Brankow and Ramsdell demonstrated that a master gene, FOXP3, is essential for that regulation to exist. This award recognizes that control, not just warfare, is the most important part of the immune system. For decades, we believed that the problem with the immune system was that it didn't attack enough. And today we know that many times the real problem is that nobody tells it when it has to stop. This finding didn't just change textbooks. What it does is explain why millions of people develop autoimmune diseases and why others don't. And it's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. Well, all of the above has led us to a central idea. The immune system doesn't regulate itself with weapons alone. It regulates itself with messages. Tregs are not police officers who just go around shooting. They are the authority. They are the sheriff. And authority doesn't usually shout. They speak. And how does the sheriff convince the soldier? Well, through chemical words called anti-inflammatory cytokines. And cytokines are basically chemical messages, phrases, orders, and biological whispers. The most important of these cytokines is interleukin-10, IL-10. It is a chemical message that directly turns off inflammation immediately. They also use TGF-beta, TGF-beta, which helps repair the tissues damaged by the fight. And when interleukin-10 was discovered, many scientists despised it because it didn't attack. Once again, it didn't destroy and it didn't inflame. And so what did they do? They called it the surrender cytokine. But today, we know something radically different. IL-10 is not synonymous with surrender. It is genuine damage control. IL-10 tells the soldier, stop shooting, lower the intensity, and do not continue to escalate the problem. It is, in other words, it is the immediate ceasefire. Without IL-10, the inflammation does not turn off. The response becomes chronic and the healthy tissue begins to suffer. And here comes the key. The main producers of IL-10 are the Tregs. Without sheriffs, there is not enough IL-10, and without IL-10, the fire is never put out. But a good sheriff not only stops the fight, but also repairs the damage afterwards. And that's where TGF-beta comes in, which is the signal that says the danger has passed, now it's time to repair and rebuild. That is, it acts on tissue regeneration, healing, and restoration of balance. And again, Tregs are one of the key sources of TGF-beta. And without Tregs, not only is there an endless attack, but there is also poor repair of inflammatory scars, you find fibrosis and progressive deterioration. That is, without sheriffs, we would die in a few days, devoured by our own immune system. The health of your cathedral depends directly on how many sheriffs you have patrolling your corridors. And now let's stop again. Because what a lot of information I have just given you. I hope you are not getting scared. And I hope you see it, and that it serves as a general picture that can give meaning to the unique, which is of genuine importance, and what you should really cherish and hold on to in your life. There are messages that quiet the war inside your body. In other words, there is a solution. Well, to complete the big picture for you, for a sheriff to be respected by the soldiers, he needs a badge. In biology, that badge is a protein that is produced inside the cell thanks to a master gene we have talked about earlier, called FOXP3. FOXP3 is a transcription factor. Think of it as the instruction manual that tells a cell, from now on, you are no longer a warrior, you have become a diplomat whose goal is peace. Bem-tom pa-fir. FOXP3 is not just any gene. In fact, it is one of the few genes that, when it fails, turns the immune system into your worst enemy. If the FOXP3 gene is turned on, that is, if it is expressed, the cell becomes a sheriff, a Treg. If the gene is turned off, meaning it is silenced, the sheriff disappears and chaos takes over the body. Just look at how important it is. In fact, there is a terrible disease called IPEX syndrome. Children who suffer from it are born with this gene broken, and as a result, their immune system attacks all their organs at once. And within a few days, despite being strong, extremely strong, they pass away. I mentioned it to you at the beginning of the video. But what's interesting about this is that it's the definitive proof that FOXP3 is the master switch of peace. Sadly, IPEX syndrome is not just a theory. It is the clinical demonstration that without FOXP3, life turns into self-destruction. But take a breath, because this is not your case. You do have this gene, and the question is simply how it is expressed. And the good news is that we, through epigenetics, that is, what we eat, how we breathe, or how we live, can help keep this gene always switched on and, pay attention, producing serifs. To give you a very simple summary of what I just mentioned. IL-10 is the order to stop. TGF-beta is the order to repair. The Tregs are the ones who issue the orders, the sheriff, and FOXP3 is the one who decides when to stop. And to focus on what really matters to us, the true essence of a long life doesn't simply depend on the sheer number of enemies that you manage to defeat. Rather, it depends much more on how many times your physical body and your inner self know exactly how to recognize your limits and say, enough is enough, at the right time. But there's still one issue left to clarify. Many people often come to me with a look of confusion and ask me, but Jose Maria, why is it that my own body, despite being so remarkably wise and knowing everything that we currently know about biology, would still choose to actively turn against and attack me in such a confusing way? And the fascinating answer to this question is usually found in the process of molecular mimicry. Molecular mimicry happens when a virus, bacteria, or free pathogen has fragments, that is antigens, that closely resemble proteins in your own body. Your immune system learns to attack the invader, and up to this point, everything is perfect. So what's the problem? Well, the problem arises when that resemblance is just too good. And to give you an image that might help you understand it, imagine a virus entering your body that happens to be wearing a jacket very similar, for example, to the protein in your thyroid. Your army? It learns to shoot at that jacket. The problem comes when that virus dies, that is, when it has been killed. But the soldiers see your thyroid and think it's still wearing the same jacket, so they start shooting again. Now I'm going to give you some more examples, because these situations are very real and it's likely that you or someone close to you could benefit from them. If that's the case, don't hesitate. Share the video with him or her. Imagine a very common infection, a streptococcus. The immune system learns to recognize and attack it. All of this is fine. Ultimately, that's what it's supposed to do. But the problem arises when that streptococcus happens to look too much like a part of your own body. In certain cases, it tends to resemble the structure of the human heart valves. The soldier who has learned says, "This is dangerous." And when he sees something similar again, what he does is shoot. But it doesn't shoot at the bacteria. What it's actually doing is attacking your own valves, and this ends up causing what we call rheumatic fever. Let me give you another example. Some viruses have fragments that closely resemble myelin. Myelin is the insulating layer of your nerves. The immune system attacks the virus, but afterwards it can no longer tell the difference and starts attacking the myelin. It's not really because it wants to destroy you, but rather because it wants to protect you and believes it has to keep fighting. And that's when multiple sclerosis appears. Let's look at another case. In the intestine, we coexist with thousands of bacteria. If some of them resemble your own intestinal tissue too much, the immune system goes on constant alert. And if nothing stops that response, the inflammation becomes a permanent fixture in your body. This is what we see in diseases like Crohn's. And one more. Some viruses have a dangerous similarity to the cells of the pancreas, that is, the ones that produce insulin. And the immune system, as it's designed to do, attacks the virus. But then it ends up confusing the target and ends up destroying those cells. And that's when type 1 diabetes appears. And now pay close attention to something important. In all these cases, the problem isn't that the immune system attacks once. The core problem is that nobody is telling it exactly when it should stop. Molecular mimicry explains why the system gets confused, but the Tregs, the sheriffs, explain why that confusion turns into disease. The army isn't bad, it's just confused. And it's confused because you don't have enough sheriffs, Tregs, who are able to correct the mistake. That's why in this series about rebuilding the cathedral, we don't want to lower the defenses, that is immunosuppression. What we want is to raise the level of education, immunomodulation. And we want more sheriffs, not fewer soldiers. The problem isn't that the army makes a mistake once. The problem is that without sheriffs, that mistake becomes a habit. And it's important to clarify this because in reality, mimicry doesn't start the problem. What it does is simply make it or turn it into a chronic problem because it doesn't encounter any breaks or because the breaks don't work properly. So that you can perhaps understand it from another perspective. We all have infections, and we all experience molecular mimicry. We activate aggressive lymphocytes, and we also generate inflammation. But that's not the disease. That's simply life. The difference doesn't lie in having a healthy immune system and activating it. The difference is in knowing how or being able to deactivate it in time. In situations like the ones I've described, the system has two possible outcomes when an immune attack occurs due to viruses, bacteria, stress, or trauma. The first solution, when the system's brakes are working, that is, when the Tregs are functioning, the FOXP3 coordinates, IL-10 is released, and TGF-beta is activated. The attack is shut down. Shortly after, the tissue repairs itself and the episode comes to an end. In other words, the result is that the person recovers and there is neither disease nor any trace left. And the conclusion in the end is that nothing serious happened. But now let's look at the second option, when the system has no brakes. Here, the Tregs are insufficient or dysfunctional. FOXP3 is silenced or altered, and IL-10 is not enough. The inflammation doesn't subside, the attack becomes chronic, and the tissue undergoes continuous damage. What do you think the result is? Well, it's very simple. The response becomes an identity. An autoimmune disease appears in the body. It attacks itself relentlessly. With all that said, keep one thing in mind. We are not born without brakes. What happens is that the brakes wear out. And what are the factors that reduce the 3-FOXP3 over time? Chronic stress, sustained inflammation, lack of deep sleep, disruption of the circadian rhythm, repeated infections, immunological aging, energy deficit or low voltage, and a constantly inflammatory environment. That's why a young person usually recovers, but the same person years later no longer recovers. And it's not because the body becomes bad. What happens is that it loses its ability to regulate. The fundamental distinction between true healing and a problem becoming chronic comes down to a single significant word: brakes. And now let's talk a bit more specifically about them. The question is, do we have the ability to make more sheriffs, that is, more Tregs, in our kitchen and in our daily life? Well, it turns out that yes, we do. Take note, because what I'm about to give you now is the practical manual. Of course, this does not replace medical treatments, but what it does do is explain why many treatments fail when the system is without brakes. And another thing. One more thing, you don't have to start doing this tomorrow. What I'm suggesting is that you take some time to understand why each piece has its value and matters. And with all that clarified, I'm going to present to you 4 ways in which you can take action. The first, vitamin D3, the master hormone. Vitamin D, as you know, is not actually a vitamin. What it is an epigenetic signal, and the vitamin D receptor enters the nucleus of your cells and binds directly to the FOXP3 gene to activate it. Without vitamin D, it's very difficult to have sheriffs, and you need optimal levels between 60 and 80 nanograms per milliliter. And my advice regarding the doses you might need, if you need them, is to consult your doctor. The second, short-chain fatty acids, that is butyrate. The good bacteria in the gut, that is the microbiota, produce a substance called butyrate when you eat fiber and resistant starch. And butyrate is the food that trains the Tregs in the intestine. A healthy gut produces sheriffs. Third, omega-3A2. Resolvins. Oily fish and krill oil provide fatty acids that produce resolvins, which, as their name suggests, serve to resolve the battle. And they tell the army the war is over, pick up the debris and leave. 4. Vagal breathing. As we saw in the vagus nerve series, when you breathe slowly and especially deeply, you send a signal to your immune system. You're telling it that we're safe because chronic stress kills the cells, but inner peace multiplies them. All right, after this long and winding journey, there is just one more thing left to say. Regaining control of your army is the highest possible act of dignity. You can't be free if you live in fear of your own biology. Your cathedral needs light, voltage, but it also needs laws. In other words, tracks, sheriffs. And when the sheriff returns to town, inflammation goes down, pain disappears, and energy becomes available again for living, not for fighting. Autoimmunity should not be a life sentence. It's a sign that your system has lost control. That much is true. But now you know how to try to give it back. If you feel that this message could bring peace to someone living at war with their health, you would be doing me a great favor, and them as well, if you shared this video with them. Let's try to help more people awaken their inner sheriff. In the next video, we'll talk about lymphatic cleansing, or how to activate your brain's sewage system while you sleep. And all of this so that rust simply doesn't block your light. And with that, as the cartoons used to say, that's all for today. As I always say, keep moving forward. Always forward.